forward as Hashem to continue where we left off last week on page 216 on 5 lines from the bottom, of course in the original text. We're referring to, that is, the original text. There's a period there, achar brias ha'adam, which is after man's creation. So what we were talking about last week, contrasting the way it was before creation and the way it was after creation. From the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu extending himself. When you say extending himself, usually it means you're going out of your comfort zone and you're entering in someone else's domain for someone else's interests, for someone else's benefit, and so on. In this case, remember we learned last week, the great Kaviyachol. We have to, of course, always add the word Kaviyachol when we talk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because nothing is difficult for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but nonetheless, the way it's set up, the Seder Ishtalshel, the order of evolution is set up, known as Seder Ishtalshel, which would be easily simply translated as the order of revolution, meaning, say, the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu established this order, which eventually there is the evolution of all elements from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, meaning to say HaKadosh Baruch Hu created matters, not that He is the Kol Yochel, it starts from Him, the Kol Yochel, right away there's creation. Everything went through a certain process, and within that process we could appreciate the terminology even when it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to say that He made an effort. He makes an effort. Famous expression, Ein simcha elanes. You don't rely on miracles. Why can't you rely on miracles? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is infinite. What's the big deal for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make a miracle? There's no big deal for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make a miracle. None at all, for that matter, of course. He is the infinite Almighty. But nonetheless, He established a certain system that when He has to intervene into nature, because one is not acting with the natural parameters of life, if you will, the natural parameters which HaKadosh Baruch Hu Himself set up within this very world, and the way He, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, wanted the world to run, if you will, wanted the world to progress, and you do something different and something out of the ordinary deliberately, and He has to intervene and establish this miracle to save you, to save your financial situation, to save your child, and whatever it is. So then that effort, you have to be cautious about that effort, because if He made an effort for you, it was something that He extended Himself for you, and at that point you have to be, I say, careful, because the Gemara says, they take off the points, they take off from the points of your portfolio and your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Literally would mean merits, loosely translated. They remove your merits from your portfolio, from your list, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to do something, make a special effort for you. So automatically, the points the merits which you built up, more than the usual, comes off your chart. I say more than the usual because Hashem is always giving us, even when we do things naturally and we succeed naturally. Of course, it's always with Hashem's brachas, and therefore we have to always refill, if you will, our portfolio with more and more merits. That there should be that balance, that equilibrium, the way Hashem Himself established. And like we're actually learning over here, that it all depends. It's all Hashem's extension is always reciprocal. This is basically the message of today. And therefore, when we were talking about the HaKadosh Baruch Hu's effort, was in the context of the deepest seichel, the deepest areas of intellect, meaning to say this which is even closer and yet closer to the nefesh, to the core soul. And I say this because this was the message in the last class, the class before, where Alter Rebbe establishes the whole phenomenon of speech, which comes from the deepest core of the nefesh, yet it ends up connecting with the heimaitzes hapeh, the instruments of the mouth, which allows us to actually pronounce the words, the phrases, and so on and so forth. Again, you have to see it in the previous classes. So because Baruch has to condense Himself from something so, like Alter Rebbe gives an example, the way it is by a human being, a great, wise, and intellectual personality has to take all that and put it into one letter, into one. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this world with one letter. Of course, it extended itself to the Asara Mamaris, to the 10 sayings, but it was with one letter. Take all that and condense it and contracted. You need the contraction in order to be manifest in one letter. It's enormous effort. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu did that in order to create all the worlds and ultimately this very physical world. But that was all Isarus La'ela without Asarus Lasat, which was an arousal from on high without the arousal from below. It's because Ki Chafetz Chesed is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is inherently kind, and He extended Himself and He did all that in order to create this world. All the elements, particularly this world, which here there's the Kabbalah, like the famous Perik of the Alter Rebbe, or chapters of the Alter Rebbe, in Lamed Vav, Lamed Zayin, in Likutei Amorim, and this is where Hashem's objective and goal is, and Hashem did all that, and He pulled Himself into that one us, into the one letter, in order to be to create, and to be the creator, and so on. It wasn't reciprocal, because Adam Ayin Lamedes Adama, as the pasuk says, and the Alter Rebbe quotes it again in the context of cultivating the earth. Then in Parshas Bereshis there was no man. Versus after man is created, the whole system changes. There's the system of reciprocity, and that man there's arousal from below. Man does his avodah, and Hashem reciprocates. This is where we're holding now. A few lines we said over here, quite brief and maybe perhaps a bit. If you didn't learn these chapters, if you're not following, you're a newcomer, a bit cryptic perhaps, but that's why, as we mentioned many times, wherever you're watching it, there's the original website tanyaonline.com, which you have the opportunity to see the previous classes. They're set up on the left side in the screen, and the previous classes all the way down to the Likutei Amorim. We just quoted Likutei Amorim from the 36th chapter and on. We quoted it in the context of this world being the ultimate purpose. As an example, you have it as well on the site. We merited to conclude Likutei Amorim, Shayich V'Emunah, Igeres HaTshuva, and we're holding the fourth segment, which of course we mentioned quite a few times, set up very different. This is not a sequential segment with sequentially written, but rather this is Igeres. This is letters, epistles, which each one is separate, of course, as any as you classify any letter, categorize any letter. It's written to a community or to all communities of the Alter Rebbe, but nonetheless it was it was addressing a particular issue, or what the Alter Rebbe was encouraging a certain matter to a certain community, to all communities even, but nonetheless every letter, understandably by definition, that is distinct in another letter. Even though we did mention, and it's always good to mention Alter Rebbe, if you want to find any overall message from all the 32 Igeres Alter Rebbe, many more. We know there's a sefer, the set of the Igeres of the Alter Rebbe, the letters of the Alter Rebbe called Igris Kodesh of the Alter Rebbe, the holy epistles of the Alter Rebbe. But in the Tanya there's 32, and throughout you can say that the Alter Rebbe addresses, of course, the Midatayr, Kibah Mitzvah, but Stucca, we can definitely, there's not even a question that Stucca, the mitzvah, the unique mitzvah of Stucca is well underscored in these chapters, explained thoroughly with this in a very unique way. I don't think anybody ever explained this mitzvah in such a manner, a whole different perspective and an appreciation to this very mitzvah, which Alter Rebbe presents in these chapters of Igeres HaKodesh, in these letters, that is. So last week we left off how Chesed Avraham, Bihi Baram has the same words of Avraham, because the whole world was created because Chafetz Chesed came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's kindness, his inherent kindness. Here we continue today. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Shekel Midbarei. We continue today. Acher Brias Ha'adam. However, after man was created, La'avda, etc., he says Chulu, to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the word which is a quote of Parshas Bereshis, Ula Shamra, to guard the Gan Eden. If you remember, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Adam Rishon, to Gan Eden, La'avda Ula Shamra, to cultivate, to work with the field, Ula Shamra, and to guard it. Many understandings, what does it mean, guarding it? from who? But namely, guarding it that it should grow nicely. You have a field, you have to not only cultivate it or work with the field, you have to guard it that nothing negative, no should grow would disturb the development of this which you're trying to grow in your field, this plant, the seed, and so on. So Chassidus teaches that la'ovda is the mitzvah saseh, or it says in a number of places. Zayir, la'ovda is mitzvah saseh, u'lishamra, in other areas in Pnimis HaTorah, u'lishamra is to guard, is referring to the mitzvah leisesa, which means HaKadosh Baruch Hu mandate the yid, for that matter, any human being. There's this which Hashem asks the human being, particularly the yid, to actively do, and this which HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks from any human being, and particularly the yid, is not to do, to refrain from, to stay away from, which is the mitzvahs, namely when you talk about the yid, the mitzvahs leisesa, the 365 mitzvahs which Hashem says we are not allowed to do, not allowed to engage with. And you have 248 mitzvahs, asay, the positive mitzvahs, la'ovda, that we actively do. Hashem sent man, we could be created man, la'ovda l'shamra, did he have all, the entire Torah? Everything was of course different, but the general message was already embedded in Torah when it comes to creation of man, which is the center of all creation. That he came to this world, la'ovda, to actively do what Hashem wants, l'shamra, to guard himself from this which Hashem says not to do, to refrain from. So after man was created, the system changed. Kol azai, then kol isarusa de la'ela, la'ere midas chesed da'elyin, hu bisarusa l'sata b'tzedakah. At that point, every arousal of an high, and in order to arouse the on high, which is in this context the attribute of the supreme kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, comes bisarusa l'sata, is through the arousal of below. Now when you say the arousal of below, we're of course referring to this which you're trying to arouse. When you want to try to arouse a particular expression, attribute of another party, you could arouse it in different ways. When you want to establish any type of relationship, it's a give and take one way or another, but when you're looking out for a particular expression of the other party, you extend yourself in the same manner. Meaning to say, in this case, it's not only that man serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Hashem would reciprocate. Of course, that's the way it is. Yisrus l'sata, any type of Yisrus l'sata, if it's learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, arouses. Yisrus l'sata would mean the arousal of below. Any type of arousal below arouses the on high. Isarusa de la'ela, the arousal of an on high. It does that very arousal to arouse the on high, to extend itself to the below. But in this case, we're looking for Hashem's chesed, we're looking for Hashem's kindness, as he explained last week. And again, you have to see the idea of last week, why HaKadosh Baruch Hu coming down from the deep level of Chokhmah, or namely the Ein Sof domain of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to come down into one letter, Kibukashem Tzuri Lamim. Even the Asar Mamar is the way it's broken down. It's a big deal. Again, you have to see the very previous class. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to extend himself, that you need Hashem's kindness to extend himself. So you want Hashem's chesed, you have to do something similar to arouse Hashem's chesed, which is of course extending your chesed. In this case, it would be tzedakah, to extend yourself with charitable work, with actual charity, extending yourself to another party, leaving your comfort zone and extending yourself to someone who needs this help, who needs this assistance, and is lacking, and you're extending yourself in order to fulfill this which the other party is lacking. That arouses HaKadosh Baruch Hu to leave his comfort zone and come into that us, ultimately, like we explained last week. Again, you need to see the previous class. In order to be the creator, in order to establish that relationship with man, in other words, primarily create all the elements, this very physical world, and establish that relationship. So you need the chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah, that's the midah that you have to underscore. That's the midah you have to invest in, because you're looking for this la'ela, Hashem's arousal in chesed. Hashem has to do the chesed to come into that one us, one letter, from his infinite domain and be the creator of all worlds, and particularly this Elam Hazeh. It has, therefore, with charity and kindness, which the Yid does in this very physical world. Because you need to arouse Hashem's kindness. So the entire relationship is built in a way that is established in a way that any type of investment in Maya Avodas Hashem, of course, arousals the arousal of from on high. The Resurus of the Le'ela. However, when you're looking for a particular expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to extend his additional chesed, his overall kindness, but a deep kindness. And in this case, it's an enormous kindness for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come down from his domain and to be the creator, to come into that one us. We have to extend ourselves. We have to establish that as Sarusal Asata, that arousal from below, in the same fashion, to extend ourselves with giving a lot of tzedakah, extending chesed in kindness in this world. The Chazal tell us, our sages of blessed memory, tell us that someone's going to say, I only have Teira. However, I do not have Gimilus Chasadim, meaning to say, I'm okay, let someone else do kind acts and charitable acts, and I'm going to invest my life in learning Torah. And in the end of the day, isn't the Torah Hashem's Torah? And there's so much reward speaking about Torah, there's so much spoken about Torah. And if you look, particularly Chassidus, you see the advantage of the union with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which comes through Torah, even more than mitzvahs. It has even an accolade over mitzvahs. There is something inherently great and advantageous with the learning Torah, even over fulfilling Hashem's mitzvah. So one's going to say, it's not that I want to do my stuff and let someone else do charitable work. I'm going to learn Hashem's Torah, and I'm going to learn it diligently. And the Gemilas Chasadim, the tzedakah, the charitable and kind acts, which every Yid is demanded, every human being, particularly the Yid is demanded, let someone else do it. I'm involved in Hashem's Torah, even Hashem's Torah. I'm involved in the divine work of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm involved in the divine energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is what Torah. Torah is the energy of Anechi Hashem Elikecha. Says the Gemara, our sages of blessed memory say, at that point, you don't even have the virtue of Torah. If you're relegating Gemilas Chasadim and you're saying, I'm just going to get involved in Torah without Gemilas Chasadim, you're missing the message. It's not going to work. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have also sat in his domain and learned Torah. For that matter, it says HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mishtashea. He derives delight from his Torah because the Torah is part of him. The Torah is the domain of the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu could also remain in his domain. And Chas v'Shalom, you know what that means. You want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to continue to be mashpia, to extend the energy and extend all that life force in order to be the creator, to create and to create this world and to create you and to give you what you need. To be that chafetz chesed, but over here, in this context over here, is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's bli gvul, to come into that one us, to be the creator. Yeah, you must get involved in chesed, because chas v'shalom, if you don't, what are you establishing? You're looking for the measure per measure. HaKadosh Baruch Hu could also close and isolate himself in his domain, learn Torah, meaning to say, get involved in appreciate his domain of infinity, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is infinite, and leave the whole, not pay attention, chas v'shalom, to coming down and being that creator. You don't want that. So Chazal say, Torah, of course, is that unique and exclusive type of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And as we said before, the union which a Yid unites with HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Torah even has an advantage over even doing mitzvahs. But that's not good enough. You must get involved in acts of kindness, because you're always looking for Hashem's kindness to come down and be the creator, as explained in the previous class. But not to relegate Torah, of course. Torah, to get involved in Torah, to occupy yourself in Torah, and in kind acts. Even though, again, we're not talking about someone just isolating himself or distancing himself or separating himself into some intellectual investment, pursuit, but you're talking about the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So apparently there's a union with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As he says, Torah comes from the wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's Torah, Beiraisa, more so additional to that. Beiraisa Niskayim Alma. The world stands with the energy of Torah. Uve'inan Delan Baba. Those who diligently, assiduously are involved in Torah. So this apparently should be suffice. And why do I have to get involved in Gemilas Chasadim, in acts of charity, in acts of kindness, extension of myself to other parties and so on? Let me learn Torah. The Torah is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And more so, it says that with the energy of the world, the Torah, rather, the world stands, and from those who invest themselves in learning Torah. So the Alter Rebbe says, yes, that's correct. I'm not denying that. But nonetheless, it's not bringing the energy all the way down into the us itself for Hashem to be the actual creator. It's the starting point. It's drawing the energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That energy should be manifest throughout, but nonetheless, it doesn't have the ability to give that push that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should come down into that one us and to be a creator, to actually create and provide and extend himself to creation. And let's just get back to the mashal. The easiest way to understand is get back to that mashal. If you remember when the Alter Rebbe spoke about speech, he said the speech comes from the chokhmah, the deepest levels of the person's development, this which is so close to the nefesh. Again, we're not going to go over this, but you see it in the previous class, but namely the class before, maybe even prior to that, the class prior to that, that the whole structure of speech is man, which is again, given that gift of speech, it begins with the chokhmah. As we explained a number of times, someone mute, there's something compromised in his chokhmah shebenefesh. In other words, there's something he's a bit not. The idea that the reason why he can't speak is not because there's anything wrong with the 5 instruments. He has the tongue, the lips, the teeth and gums and throat. He's able, from that perspective, there is no issue. It's that there's a certain lack of his being a healthy human being, meaning to say, in the deepest parts of his nefesh, we're not talking about the godly soil of his nefesh, there's some fragmentation one way or another, because that's where the real speech commences, initiates, comes from. We explain this at length, that we can only appreciate. It's not because you have that for those 5 instruments. The mute also has the 5 instruments. Why can he pronounce a word or a sentence? As we mentioned sometimes, many times, it's just painful to watch that he begins and he tries to utter words, but it's all based on the instruments, not where the speech originally comes from, which is the chokhmah shebenefesh. So the way is by the therefore it's difficult for him, and it's difficult even to hear because it's not where speech begins from, commence from. If we'd all understand and appreciate, again, we elaborate on this point. It makes perfect sense, especially after we learned about it, that the healthy person speaks when he speaks. It's the nefesh, the healthy nefesh, which is able to be the one who talks and has the gift of speech. As Lashon, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, he speaks about the nefesh. Rabbi Yehuda, the nefesh chaya, says the Targum Onkelos, the famous translator Onkelos Hager, he says, which is the Onkelos, the Targum, which is printed in the average Chumash, and usually in every Chumash, the famous Targum is a l'ruach malala, to a spirit of words, of talking, because that's what the healthy nefesh is all about. That is the distinction of man, the superiority of man over any other creation. He or she is able to talk. And that comes from the nuances of the nefesh, the nuanced energy of the nefesh, or the nuanced areas of the nefesh. As we can all appreciate, a healthy person is able to talk. The fact that the words and the sentences and the phrases are formulated, organized in an organized manner through the Hey Meitzis Hapeh, through the 5 instruments of the mouth, that's secondary. That's inferior. That's an external. That's not where the iciest, the real letters come from. in the end of the day, you need that chitzenius also, as that Alter Rebbe explained, because you need the formation, you need the structure of the letters, the words, the sentences, the phrases, and so on. So of course they kick in. And to the contrary, they're very central in order to actually execute the word or the sentence, the statement. If chas v'shalom, sometimes someone hurt their tongue or their lips, you hear it in expression. There's something unclear. Of course, it's crucial to have these 5 mitzvahs very healthy in order to execute the word, in order to pronounce the word, as an example. But that's not where it comes from. Again, we gave the example. You can see it by the mute, Rahman al-Islam. He has it all. He has all the instruments in its place, but nonetheless, he or she can Rahman al-Islam. Rahman al-Islam. We should only have this as a mushal, but not chas v'shalom. In reality, people should be gesund and stark, healthy, and strong, in order to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu with joy and gladness of heart, which includes all the brachas. Hashem should extend himself to every single yid. But as a mushal, we could see it by a mute. Someone is mute. They have all the instruments, but they can't talk because the talk begins from the nefesh. So, of course, when you're talking about a nafshistic involvement, a soul type of involvement, which is the idea of learning Torah vis-a-vis keeping Hashem's mitzvahs, and particularly the idea of tzedakah, chesed, extending yourself with gemilus chasadim. And of course, that has the ability to extend the energy. Ultimately, that very energy which would give kiyum, which would give existence to this world, and namely for those who learn Torah, diligently learn Torah, the learn, but they toil in Torah, of course they're drawing the energy down from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like someone wants to start, or starts talking, or establishes that he is going to express himself with words. It begins as something rushes. Of course, you're talking about something instantaneous, instinctive. So it's not really time. It's not when it comes from the nefesh and it comes down and then it enters into the 5 instruments and eventually you pronounce the word. Of course, everything happens instinctively and as such instantaneously. Understandably so. But there's the first part, of course, it's manifest from the nefesh, and eventually it'll enter into the 5 instruments, which is known as Hey Maitzis Hapeh, which would ultimately pronounce that organized word. Understandably so. So you have the 2 stages, and understandably when somebody focuses on the first stage, which is similar, which is synonymous with the idea of Limud HaTorah, which is coming from Hashem's Chochmah, right? That's where the speech initiates. Of course you're drawing energy, and of course that energy would be ultimately the kiyum, the existing force which allows Olam, the world, to exist. But that's not enough, because if you have the Amshach of Chas v'Shalom, someone's 5 instruments, as we call them, the Heimetzah, they're compromised, you can't formulate a sentence, a proper sentence, for the other party to hear, to appreciate, to understand, to get it to glean from its message, this which you want the other party to. It's unclear, perhaps even unclear to yourself, because you don't have it. In other words, you can't hear any structured phrase, any structured sentence. Chas v'shalom, when someone's the Hey Meitzes Hapeh compromised, you need the 5 these 5 instruments in order to execute, in order to establish, in order to pronounce that statement, that sentence, which you want to convey. So the original energy is, of course, coming from Torah. And you're drawing the energy like someone decides to speak. Again, there's no 2 stages. It's harder to explain because it's not 1 stage and 30 seconds later, or 3 seconds later, or 3 milliseconds later, and then it comes into the instruments. You will say, okay, Torah does number 1, and doing Mils Chasadim, which is the actual giving, extending oneself, which is similar to the idea of the action, the chesed, which you want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to connect that chokhmah with the letter Hey, with the actual koyach, in other words, the source and the force of energy, which is a big deal, as we said. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to come down into that, which is the idea of the chokhmah coming down. Again, it would be easier to explain if there was space and time between them. that the Chokhmah draws the energy, but nonetheless, you need the Heimetzis, you need the Chesed, you need the kindness in order to Kodesh Baruch Hu to equally reciprocate that energy to come into the us in order to be the actual creator. It comes in the end of the day in the same time. You talk instantaneously, and this is instinctive. You're talking, you're drawing the energy from your nefesh, and it immediately enters into Heimetzis. But nonetheless, we could understand, we could divide, we could appreciate this. The two. There's two things going on over here, simultaneous, but nonetheless, it's two separate ideas. So the Torah is the Chokhmah v'Kodesh Baruch Hu, which is tantamount to that energy of the nefesh becoming the ruach memalala, the spirit of talk. That is the original energy, which is mahaba mechayim, meaning to say that is gives the miskayim. Let's use the lashon over here. Brings existence to Eilamis. And that's what happens when a person learns Torah. He's drawing from Hashem's Chokhmah. But that's not enough. Drawing from the Nefesh to be a Ruach Melala doesn't establish these sentences, these phrases which you want to convey to the other party and to establish that relationship with the other party. Or to whatever you want to accomplish with those words. You cannot pronounce words just by being that Nefesh Ruach Melala. Again, evidently, when someone's one of the Heimetzis Apeh is compromised or burnt his tongue or whatever it is, it doesn't come out clear. As we spoke about this in the previous classes. So the original Amshacha, of course, comes from the original drawing of the energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, comes from Torah. Because the Buram, the one who's learning Torah, Mamshich Ma'aras Vashpaz, Chachma Ilah Mekerete, you're drawing the Chachma Ilah. Similar to one decided, starting the original process of speaking, which is the supreme Chokhmah, wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the source of Torah, and you're bringing it, you're drawing it into the words, Shabani V'ra'elim, for which the world was created. Chazal tell us, Al Tikra Banayich Ala Bainayich. Then, as we say it every single day, in the end of Kavi, if you remember, towards the end of that segment of Kavi, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, V'rav Shloim Banayich, a lot of peace to your children. It says, Al tikri banayich ela bainayich. Those who that referring to those who learn Torah alichas elam lei, Al tikri alichas ela alachis, and those who learn Torah are called the bainayich. They're called the ones who structure elam hazard. They're building elam hazard through the learning Torah. But nonetheless, and of course something is happening over here. But nonetheless, you have to establish that Yerida of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not just like you're taking a pen and just drawing a line from the Chokhmah to the Dibur. We're talking about a great effort of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's decision that he has to come from that high, deep, and profound domain, which we call it HaKadosh Baruch Hu's comfort zone, the Chokhmah, the infinity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to want it to come down into the speech. So of course you're drawing the energy from the Mekayr when you talk, now for that matter, it makes even more sense. There's no divide, it's one expression. You're talking, you're allowing the Chacham Shebenefesh to express itself, and right away it would come into words, automatically, instinctively, as we said before. But you're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're wanting to decide to make that great Yerida, that great descend from that Chachma into the letter, into the Hay, into the Yud for that matter, and into the Hay, and eventually into the Asara Ma'amoris, the 10 sayings through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, as we spoke many times. In this context of HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke creation into being. That is what it means, Asara Ma'amoris Nibra Ha'elam. So you want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to make that Yerida. You want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come down, to touch base, to touch down, that is, into the Isis. That's not enough. Your learning Torah is not enough. You have to do something which should arouse HaKadosh Baruch Hu's chesed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's kindness, to want it to come down into the formation of letters, into these Asar Mamaris, starting from that Hey, or the Yud K, Kibi Yud Kibi Kashem, Tsuri Lamin, created the world. At that point you have to get involved in acts of kindness, in acts of charity. You're extending yourself to another party. Sometimes it's difficult, based on what is demanded from you at that point, the needs of the other party. Sometimes you just to step out of your comfort zone, which is already arousing HaKadosh Baruch Hu to step out of his comfort zone and to come down into Dibur, which is the source and force of creation. Sometimes you have to do beyond that, not just step out, but you have to really get involved. But understand, the more you're getting involved in these charitable and kind acts, the more you're drawing it, because it's easier for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come down into these letters, despite kaviyachol, it's difficult, it's not easy. As we explained, the whole terminology of not easy for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because this is all based on when we began in today's class, that after man was created, this is the way the system works. Measure per measure, or in the Lashon of Yer, Isarusa de Sato, arouses us. If you want a Seder's arousal from on high, that Kodesh Baruch Hu, to take that quantum leap step, you extend yourself. And the more you extend yourself to the other party, the more HaKadosh Baruch Hu is coming down. It's easier for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come down based on this which HaKadosh Baruch Hu established, that there is, again, the rule of reciprocity, that what you do arouses me to equally do, meaning to say to do the same. So when you extend yourself with tzedakah, and you extend yourself with chesed, that makes it easier for that energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's chachma to come into these asias. And that's what he says, all good and fine. Of course, Talmid Chacham, the builders, the constructors of Eilam, like we just explained before. But it's a great descent, degradation for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And for this you have to arouse the supreme kindness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which comes from a very high, lofty place, to come down into a very lowly place. How do we do that? Bisaruso, the lisata, through our arousal from below. Bitzdoko v'chesed with charity. And the kindness on this plane. Shemamshichim chayim v'chesed lahachis roch shvol minitkoim. That we draw life and kindness to assist and to help and to vivify and to give a spirit of life to those who are so in need, so lowly, and Nitkoim would be those who are oppressed and down-spirited, and we help them and we extend ourselves to them. And again, many times, based on the needs of the other party, we have to really go away from our comfort zone. That instantaneously arouses the HaKadosh Baruch Hu's to come down, and to, you could even say, it becomes easy for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because again, this is the rule. It's not just a rule that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. It's like a slide. One side is down, the other side is up. Of course, not relative over here. It's not a decision of the other side to go up when when one side goes down. It happens automatically, if you will, because Hashem's rule was a rule that He set up. This is the way the system really works, and it works just as a immediate consequence or immediate result, a direct result of our arousal from below. That's the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way He, based on His establishment, reacts. Because it's not just a rule, perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu taps into that rule. Let me try this rule of reciprocity. But no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, once HaKadosh Baruch Hu established the rule, this is the way it becomes. It becomes this is the way the whole relationship between Hashem and His world, namely through man, is established. And this is the way it works forever after the creation of man. So when we do the acts of kindness and we extend ourselves to the other party, consequently HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes it easy for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, based on the rules that He set up, to come down. Okay, it's deep. It's coming from a nafshistiki area. It's coming from an area of Ein Sof, and I have to condense myself and contract all that in order to come down in one letter. Now it becomes easier because the rule of reciprocity. We'll continue just this from this basis. Pasik that it says that the pasuk says that man should not take pride with his wisdom. In the end, he says not with the mighty, with his strength. A number of few things which we read it not long ago in the Haftarah, that ki'im b'zayis yishal hamisalo. In this, one may take pride, which is in the pasuk, the extension of kindness that you can take pride of. Ki ani Hashem meisach chesed, as he continues, I am the God which does kindness. So in the overall, you read the pasuk. Okay, in the end of the day, wisdom is great, strength is great, all this is great, but the real deal, as it's conventionally appreciated, that people remember for you for what you did, not for what you taught, especially even teaching about doing good things. Not necessarily that makes a real imprint and impact on you or any other party. It's what you did. You extended yourself. You were kind to the other party. This is something which never goes away and people always remember. And this is pretty much the message. Don't take pride of your wisdom, of your strength, or any virtue or an advantage that you have, even positive. It's namely about kindness. But what does the pasuk continue? Because I, Hashem, are the one who does kindness. What's the connection? You're talking about these halachim, the person, the human being, which has all these traits and it has all these advantages, and you're telling what he or she should take pride of. In the end of the day, it's about kindness. Why does the pasuk revert back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I am Hashem who does kindness. What's the connection? You're talking about the human being and what they're meant to take pride of. But now it all makes sense, because when you extend yourself with much kindness, Ani Hashem meisach chesed, I, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will extend myself with kindness, based on everything we learned till now. Because chesed draws the life of the chokhmah down here. We'll explain in a moment. Because then the chokhmah remains on its own without drawing life from it. Which what Alter Rebbe is doing, he says, is not just something external expressions, in other words, not related to the ultimate message. Don't take pride of your wisdom, don't take pride of your might, and so on. That's why the Alter Rebbe speaks about the wisdom. In other words, v'chulu. He writes the chokhmah b'chokhmasai, and then he says v'chulu, because he's really trying to connect this pasuk to the message over here. Therefore, he doesn't bring in all the other advantages which one could take pride of. And again, because each one is another positive trait, especially it's utilized positively. Alter Rebbe says chulu, etc., etc. But he quotes the first part: "Don't take pride with your wisdom," because this is the message here. This is the way speech works. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's speech, extending himself to this world, like it is lahavda by a human being. It starts with a chachma, and it ends up in the heit meitzis hapeh and the five instruments. And it's a great yirida to come in. And again, by man it works instinctively when you want to talk, but nonetheless it is a combination of the highest and most sensitive and subtle areas in the nefesh, and it has to come down into words. And here you're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's chokhmah coming down into one letter. Ki b'ko Hashem tzuri lamim. And that's a great yirida for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if you won't do chesed, you'll remain with your chokhmah, with your learning Torah. Of course you're drawing the energy down, but it's not touching down, because it's kaviyachol difficult for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's only when you do chesed, which that's why the pasuk says that's what you should take pride of, not negating the chokhmah. Of course you need the chokhmah. Of course you need to toil in Torah, because you need to deal with that nafshizdiki expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, similar to the nafshizdiki expression, the soul type of expression, the way it is by a human being when they decide to talk. Of course, that's the initiating. That's to the contrary. That's where all the energy of speech is, which is again similar to the idea of Torah. So you have to, of course, have the chachma of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Of course, you have to learn Torah. But in order to make it easy to bring down, it's about the chesed. And when you do your chesed, that's the idea of taking pride. Not taking pride means advertise my chesed, which means in your system, you're taking pride of it in your system, meaning to say you're accentuating chesed. That's going to make it easier for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to come down. Ani Hashem meisach chesed, I am Hashem who does kindness. Shall it be so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we should be wise and do what we need to do. We should be zeichet to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's kindness, individual kindness, collective kindness, of course, the kindness which we're all waiting for, the fusion of the Ein Sof with the source of Eilam, which is the Kol, the Asar Mamaris, and ultimately in every part of the world, which is the production of the 10 sayings, that total fusion, which of course will take place the coming of Mashiach may be speedily in our days. Have a wonderful night.